It's pretty much a mess. Good morning. I'm always curious whether it's going to work or not. Well, welcome to our second in a series of end-of-life planning. So our first was the attorney that was here a month ago, and this is funeral planning. There will be a flyer in the back for the next one, which is care concerns. So there'll be someone talking about hospice, and if you're not familiar with the term death doula, she'll be talking a little bit about that too. And if throughout today you have thoughts that you think fit that sort of umbrella of care concern that you want us to make sure that gets touched on next month, don't hesitate to let us know that so that we can integrate that into the presentation. I'm just going to make a few little pitches here on the front side, maybe again on the back side before I introduce our guest speaker. But one, there will be the flyer for the care concern funeral or care concern end of life series for next month in the back before you leave today. And then we are also offering a mental health first aid class. So many of you are probably familiar with basic first aid or CPR, but there is a class out there titled Mental Health First Aid. It's a national curriculum to help people identify when they are not doing great from a mental health perspective or their loved ones, and how to approach people that you might be concerned about or how to connect them with resources. So there will also be a flyer for this. It is limited to 20 people. We did receive a grant from Thrivent, so the cost is only $10. It actually is a $175 value. And it is an 8-hour course. We're spreading it over 2 days, so 2 4-hour courses. We're gonna offer it to the folks here and in our congregation for the first month of registration, and then we'll put it in the newspaper and such if we still have seats left. But if you're interested and you want to be one of those 20, make sure to sign up with how it says to here. So there'll be some flyers on that in the back too. Otherwise, I want to introduce Jerry Thompson. He's going to be graciously speaking to us today. I'll let him introduce his background, but just know, I think he's going to have you ask questions throughout, and we are going to repeat the questions or have you talk into the mic, because we also have a streaming audience, and so we learned last month that if we don't repeat the questions using a microphone, they can't hear the question that was asked. And so we're just going to try to do a little bit better job this month of repeating the questions or else having you use a microphone to ask it. So, Jerry?
Thank you. I'm assuming I'm on, like, okay, thank you. As Mary said, my name is Jerry Thompson. I'm associated with the funeral home up in Aiken, Minnesota. I've been in the area for 36 years. I grew up in Stillwater, Minnesota, graduated from high school in Stillwater, went to the college, it was back College of St. Thomas at that point in time, so I went there for 3 years. I was in a pre-med program. But back in high school, my not next door neighbor, but lived a couple doors down from me, was a funeral director. And in high school, they were looking for somebody that would come in and vacuum rugs, wash cars, cut the grass, that type of thing. That kind of morphed into, gee, there was a Saturday, all of a sudden they had a death call in a community north of Stillwater, and the funeral director needed an extra hand. They said, Jerry, do you want to go with and help get this person? Well, sure. I mean, I didn't want to say no. It was like, so I did. And that was kind of the, really definitely the start of my interest in funeral service. But yet, as I went through high school, I could set my own hours because I was very much involved in sports. So, I was like, okay, we need to have things vacuumed. We need to have the cars ready by tomorrow morning. So if I had hockey practice or had a hockey game, I could come in at 8, 9 o'clock at night, work 2-3 hours, get everything done. As long as it was done for the morning, they were happy, and I was happy, and I made a few extra dollars for school. So that's kind of how I got started. But I still, in the back of my mind, I thought, okay, I wanted to be a doctor. So went to St. Thomas, and of course it was College of St. Thomas then, and I was in the group. When I left St. Thomas after the 3rd year, the next year, that's when they went co-ed. So, spent 3 years there, and finally after my 3rd year, it kind of dawned on me that, this funeral stuff is still really interesting. And so I transferred to the University of Minnesota, and I did their 2-year program in a year at the university, and that's kind of how I became a funeral director. I did my internship out in Wilmer, Minnesota, with Peterson Brothers, came back to the Twin Cities and worked for a while doing what they call trade work. Trade work is where it's a company that has several funeral directors, funeral homes that are out of the area or even in the area. They might call and say, gee, we have a death at Regents Hospital. Can you go over and make a removal for us, or can you go get the person and do the embalming and that, and we'll be down tomorrow morning because we're coming down from Duluth or whatever. So we would help. I did that for about 6 months. And then I actually went back to school. I went to Bemidji State for a year. Truth be known, more so because my wife-to-be was there. But I did take some classes, and I did take my AMCATs for med school. Got those results back, but at that point I was already licensed as a funeral director, and I knew in my mind that that's what I wanted to do, is be a funeral director. So I just needed to know that I could have probably gone down that road with the AMCATs, but then so at that point, my wife was still going to Bemidji. I got a job in Walker and Cass Lake. They had funeral homes, and I was working there. Worked there for 5 years, and then I had the opportunity to come to the Aiken area, and that was in January of 1986, and I have been here since. I was able to buy the funeral home in December of 1990, and owned the funeral home until January 1st of 2020 is when I opted to sell the business. I figured after 40 years, it was time. I still enjoy helping the guys out. I don't get up in the middle of the night anymore. I don't work too many weekends. They appreciate me coming out to do this because this isn't their forte, as they say. And I said, well, you got to learn how to do that. But I just needed the opportunity to step back and not be on the front line after that many years, just because I was starting to bury too many friends. And even though I like to be involved, I don't need to be right on the front line anymore. And so, when you get the phone ringing 3, 4, 5 nights in a row at 2 or 3 in the morning, and there's been a death, and you're getting up, you go and you take care of what we need to take care of. But as you're getting older, you're not the Energizer Bunny anymore, I'm finding out. I don't know how that works, but I'm not the Energizer Bunny, so it's, at this point, it's kind of nice to sleep through the night. So, but that's just a little bit of background. I do have, my wife is Val Thompson. She just retired from the hospital. She was the social worker at Riverwood Healthcare Center for years. We have 3 children. Our son, the oldest, he lives up in Halifax, Nova Scotia with his wife. Then I have 2 daughters. Both of them live in Blaine. One daughter is an assistant principal at Tartan High School. The other is a counselor at Mounds View High School. And my son, we're still trying to figure out if he's going to get a real job someday or not. Believe it or not, he is an arm wrestler. He arm wrestles. He's traveled throughout the world arm wrestling. He just got back from England. He's very good at it. He was the Canadian national champion here several years ago, and so, you know, where he gets that from, I look at my arms, I look at his arms, it didn't come from me. So, but what we want to do today a little bit is, first of all, the one rule I've got is, as we're going through things, if you've got a question, stop me and ask me. Because I want this to kind of go the direction that you have questions in, because if one of you has a question, probably several of you have that same question. So, you know, don't be afraid to ask questions. And we're going to talk about things like right of control, who gets to plan the funeral, you know, what's the difference between, you know, I want cremation. Well, what options are out there with cremation versus traditional burial? And what's a green burial? Some of these type of things. We'll have that, you know, be able to talk about some of those things. So first of all, I'm going to just start off with, does anybody know who has what's called right of control? In other words, when you die, who gets to say what happens? And you're kind of right. It's kind of a loaded question. The closest next of kin has, under Minnesota law, right of control. Now, closest next of kin normally would be a spouse or children. Now, years ago, it used to be the oldest male child. Then it was the oldest child. Now, say, I've got 3 other brothers, so there's 4 of us. And if something happened to, when something happened, not if something happens to, but someday when my mom passes away, my dad died 12 years ago. When my mom passes away, we've talked, so we have a pretty good idea what you want, but all of us have equal participation and equal say. Now, that's usually pretty good as long as everybody's on the same page. That doesn't always happen. So then at that point, what happens is a lot of times you're sitting down with a person like myself, the funeral director, and we're giving information and we're taking information, doing the things we need to do, but we also become very good at refereeing and trying to figure out, okay, how do we bring the factions together so we can get something that's meaningful pulled together and not having these fights. And believe me, I have been in my share of very interesting discussions, let's put it that way. Right to the point where there have been some, over the years I've had 3 different times where there's been discussions that have happened outside with fist flying. So, not fun to get in the middle of that, and each time they said, well, we can do this, and I said, no, this is private property, and if you're going to continue on, we will call the police. So, put your differences aside and let's take care of the matter at hand and have some respect for the person who died. So that, you know, those things happen. But, so the kids have that. Now, say each one of you, maybe the kids don't agree with what you want, if you've even talked to the kids about it, if kids or spouse. The way to take and put you in the driver's seat as far as what you want to do is to have what's called a written directive. So, a written directive is something you write down, and we normally tell families, make sure that your spouse knows, make sure the kids know, and it's not a bad thing to have a copy of your written directive, which you sign. So you'll write this out, say, okay, if I die, I want traditional burial with this and this and this, or I want cremation with this and this and this. And it's a lot of times it's a good thing to have it, give it to the funeral director to put in a file, so the funeral director has access to that also. Now, this is a written, they call it a written directive, that can be included in your healthcare directive. The problem with it being in the healthcare directive a lot of times, if the funeral home doesn't get a copy of it, or if the kids or the spouse doesn't say to the funeral director, there is a written directive out there, but it's in the healthcare directive, we don't know. So if we're not told, then we can't follow it. If there's a written directive, then by law, we have to follow what the written directive says. So if you put something like that in your healthcare directive, funeral directors we don't need to see your whole healthcare directive. We don't know if you want, in those, a lot of times they say, well, what do you want? Do you want all life-saving things and do everything you possibly can? Or if I have a terminal disease, just let it take it. We don't need to know that. But take a picture or take a copy of the page that you talk about the funeral stuff and still get that to your funeral director and let them know. Because normally in health directives, they'll say too, let your family have copies of that so that your family knows who, what you want for health care when it comes to that time.
How soon would you give it to your funeral home?
Right. So the question would be is how soon would you give that written directive to your funeral director? I'd say once you kind of got everything nailed down and you figure out this is what I want, bring a copy in, and they'll create a file, and that'll stay on file. Yes.
Well, what if you don't know which funeral home?
If the question is, what if you don't know which funeral home? And that's actually a really good question, because say you live up here, and all of a sudden, gee, we're going to use XYZ funeral home, but then things take a turn for the worse, and then say you end up down in the Twin Cities. So a decision has to be made. Do you still want to have a service up here in the Malmo area? Or will things be taken care of down in the cities or in California or wherever you end up? So for the time being, I would say you'd give it to the funeral home that you think you would use, say, here. If you move and you opt for a funeral home down in the Twin Cities or California or Florida or wherever you end up, take and get a copy to them. Now, if you're moving out of state, just check to see what that state allows. And if they allow written directives, because that's specific to Minnesota, most of them will allow you to plan your funeral and do it the way you want to. There are some that don't. So I would say that check and see what the law says. And you may not have to check. You may just say, gee, we moved here. There's a funeral home a mile away. We're going to stop in. We're going to ask, what are the laws for Florida? Do they allow written directives? And then at that point, then you can kind of process from that point to get the information you need. Yes?
Is there a form on the internet that you could use as a written directive?
The question is there a form on written directives on the internet? I'm sure there's probably something out there. It's really kind of very basic, where you might start off where I, Jerry Thompson, am creating this written directive in regards to my final wishes for funeral services. And then I would specify what I'd want, and at the bottom, I'd sign it and date it. Because pretty much healthcare directives, they'll ask some specific questions, but then there's things where you can write in on your healthcare directives too, of what you want or what you don't want. And this kind of follows that same line as far as the healthcare directives, other than it's just kind of it's several pages versus kind of a one-page thing. Yes, Pastor.
Yeah, so just to clarify, someone could put in there, I would prefer a service like a funeral service like at the church or at a funeral home. Because I know I had a case when I lived in Pennsylvania where the family, I was pretty sure that the deceased would have wanted it in the church, but they were not feeling that.
Yep. You can definitely specify, here's what I want. And
the pastor still gets the last say what goes on in the service.
Exactly. And there are, and Pastor, I'm sure you've run across this too, where, okay, gee, we're going to have the service at the church here at Bethesda. But the family comes in and said, you know, we want, as we're going out of the church, we don't want a liturgical song, we want to play Let's Roll Out the Barrel, or something like that. And I've had that. That has actually happened. And, you know, some churches would say, yeah, okay, we can do that. Other churches, it's not liturgical, we're not doing that. And then all of a sudden the family gets mad because of the one, you know, gee, I really wanted that. So then we try to figure out, okay, it's really not appropriate maybe in the sanctuary for that, but maybe we can do that at the cemetery, or we can, as we process and bring the casket or the urn outside to the hearse or to the vehicle that it's going in, we can play it outside, or we can play it at the luncheon or something. So we try to be problem solvers. Yes?
Yeah, I just thought I would offer that I really encourage you to have these discussions when it's not time sensitive or pending. Several years ago, we sat down with my in-laws, and they were very adamant about what they wanted and didn't want at their funeral, to the point that none of us kids were very comfortable with what they said they wanted and didn't want, but definitely wanted to respect their wishes. And so spent the next year or two just having a discussion with them about not allowing a luncheon after, and the opportunity that that took from us to be able to be with others who love them and who they spent their life with, and eventually were able to modify what their directive was. But had they never had that discussion and they had it written down, it would have been what it was. And when you're in the heat of the emotion of that grief and everything, it's really hard to have those conversations or feel like you're not respecting someone's wishes that you very much want to respect.
That's very true.
Yeah, and I would echo that too. That's a very good point. And I'm always happy to talk with folks ahead of time, and I'm sure Jerry, or you know, those
Yep.
that are more in the day-to-day at the funeral home would be able to talk, because that is part of it too. That a service is also for the family and for the community that's grieving your loss. And I know there are folks that you're very humble folks, and you say, well, I don't want a big to-do, but those people, they need that place to grieve too. So, but that's a great reminder to do that ahead of time and have those conversations and think through that process.
It's very true. I mean, it's one of those things where there's a lot of truth to the old saying, is that really funerals are for the living. It's not for the dead. It's for the living. Yes, it's nice to know as a family or whatever that, yeah, we're following mom's wishes, as long as it's not something that's totally off the wall. But I think, you know, if you restrict your family so much, sometimes maybe they aren't getting what they need with the funeral, because the funeral is for the living. It really isn't for the person who died. You know, and I'm using funeral in a broad sense here, but, you know, the funeral, yes, the person who dies, there's some practical things that we need to do. We need to take and figure out how will we take care of that person's remains, so it's not becoming a public health issue. In other words, are we cremating? Are we burying? Are we doing alkaline hydrolysis? Which alkaline hydrolysis, it's a newer thing that's come out, but it's with hot water and an alkaline solution, and basically all the soft tissue of the body is taken off, and then basically you have all the bones. And then you have a box that basically all the bones go in. Some people think that's great, most people don't. But there again, it's up to, you know, a family. What do you want to do? So there's that aspect that we're charged with, where a lot of people don't realize that we're charged with, at being licensed, of helping protect the health of the general community too. Because as a body just starts to decompose over time, that can be a major health hazard with some of the issues and some of the bacteria and that are proliferating within the body. And even if a person dies of, you know, if a person dies of tuberculosis, if a person, you know, dies of diphtheria, or in this day and age, the really scary one is Ebola. That's really a scary one, because all you got to do is breathe the air, and you can get it, and just basically breaks everything down within your body. So the funeral directors, everybody, you have to really, really be careful with that type of stuff. So, So there again, part of what we do too is continuing education. We learn how to keep ourselves protected and help keep the public protected too. The majority of people, majority of the time, we don't run into those things, but we still come into things like with HIV, AIDS, MRSA, all of that stuff. When COVID first came out, we know it was very contagious. We didn't know, and they still don't really know, I don't think, we haven't seen anything that really says, here's how long that virus will stay active within the body or outside of the body. The best I heard was through one of our medical examiners, that they felt that it was probably somewhere around the 48-hour mark. But that was the last I heard, and that was probably about 1.5 years ago. So, excuse me. So that's another part of what we end up doing and have to be involved in things. When a death occurs, some of the things that we help families take care of, and we've been talking a little bit about it, planning the type of service you want. We take care of, and most people in Minnesota don't realize, the funeral home, actually originate the death certificates. It doesn't get originated with the doctors or the hospitals or the nursing homes. The funeral director originates the death certificate and is charged with making sure that the doctors sign it and put the causes of death on it and it's filled out properly, and then we are also charged with then getting it filed with the local registrar, and then that goes to the state. Now, most of it's done by computer today, where we enter things on computer. If Dr. John Doe at Riverwood Healthcare Center is the doctor, once we enter everything, we push the right button, and it sends him a copy of it. He goes on electronically, looks at things, puts the cause of death, signs it, then eventually goes to our local registrar and to the state. And then we get a notification back that it has been taken care of. There are times, though, that sometimes the doctors are either on vacation or they don't get to their paperwork sometimes in a timely fashion. Then we are the ones also charged with calling the doctor saying, okay, you have Mrs. Johnson's death certificate and it's been there for 1.5 weeks or 2 weeks. We need you to sign that and get it taken care of. So friendly reminder or friendly push sometimes to the doctors is what we also have to do. We also are a very close liaison then, and I'm sure Pastor can probably verify this, that when a death occurs, with the pastors in the churches, we'll contact the pastor if the pastor hasn't already been notified that one of their congregational members has passed away. And at that point, normally we let them know that the person's passed away. We meet with the family. They set a date. We get back to the pastor and say, how does this date work for you? How's the timing of it? Yes, they would like a luncheon. Can we get the ladies together? And then we let them know, will there be a body present or not, cremation or not? And because that has some factors too. Are we going to a cemetery? Are we not? Are we going to wait to bury in the spring if it's middle of the winter time? And then at that point, we always encourage the family to talk directly to the pastor too about things like music, even though we help try to coordinate music, if there's particular scriptures, are there things that you do or do not want in a funeral service? Some families say, yes, I really want this. And if that's really good information for us as funeral directors and the pastors to know also, because if you don't tell them, don't do this and this and this, that may be kind of part of what you traditionally do, and if you don't like it, but if you don't tell the pastor, how is the pastor supposed to know? So we always encourage a meeting with the family and the pastor, and sometimes the pastor is able to come and meet with us while we're meeting with the family at the funeral. And so that really kind of makes things nice, because then we're all on the same page, and normally. So that works out well. But we help pull all this together for the families and try to make this all work. Now, that's part of when the death has occurred. But now when we're in this pre-planning thing, I've had families come in and have everything written out as far as, these are my pallbearers, these are the people that are going to sing, this is the minister, this is the time I want the service at. And what it has done is, it's very, very specific, which is kind of nice. But then the person dies 15 years later. 3 of the pallbearers no longer are living. The pastor is retired and has moved to Florida. The musicians are no longer available. And so if you get very specific, sometimes I tell families, keep an eye on that because you may want to update that information. And sometimes I tell families, like with the kids, tell the kids what you want, but don't tie their hands so much that they can't have a little bit of decision making within the borders that you're creating, because they still need to have that ability to make some of those decisions and feel like they're part of that also, even though hopefully beforehand you've had a number of good discussions about how to, here's what I want, so here's how I'd like this to go. And if all of a sudden the kids say, well, gee, I don't really like that part of it, well then discuss it. Why don't you like that part of it? And what can we do to maybe make that work? That's really, really important, is just having an open line of communication with family members. So one of the other things is, so say, and I've run into this sometimes, okay, a spouse has passed away, they don't have any children, but they have a power of attorney to somebody. The person has a power of attorney with a friend. You need to be aware of the fact that at the time of death in Minnesota, power of attorney ceases automatically. So that power of attorney doesn't carry over. So that friend doesn't technically does not have the ability to sign either cremation forms or to plan the funeral and that. That would then go off, we'd be looking for, are there brothers or sisters out there, or are there nieces and nephews out there, if there's no immediate children. So that sometimes can become an issue. But a lot of times, I've had, over the years, I don't know how many times I have people come in and say, well, even though there's kids, well, yeah, but I have the power of attorney, so I get to make these decisions. And then I have to kind of burst the bubble and say, well, no, you don't get to make these decisions because power of attorney ceases. So then the next step is, then you have to become appointed personal representative of the estate. That's kind of how that goes. And that's not going to happen until after the funeral. Some of these things we've been talking about too. Over the years, I've had families, okay, we're doing our will. We're putting this information in our will. Anybody have an idea why that's just a terrible idea? When's the will read normally? Yes, it's weeks after. It's, so, the kids might say, well, yeah, we know mom and dad have these wills and that, and they talked about it, but, well, we'll deal with that, after the fact. So all of a sudden, gee, we had burials for mom or burial for dad, and then they read the will. Well, we wanted to be cremated, and we wanted our ashes scattered in the ocean or something. Oops. Just not the best place for funeral planning. There again, the written directive, that's a much better place for it. So now, we've talked about written directive quite a bit. The next part of pre-planning is, okay, we want to fund this. How do we fund this? What do we do? There's several methods out there that a person can use. One can be, if they're fairly well off, not to worry about the pre-planning because there's going to be plenty of funds maybe within their estate to take care of it. Number two might be, well, we don't want our kids to have to worry about the estate that might be planning, but we just want this, here's what we want, we're going to pre-fund it. And in the funeral home, there's a couple ways to do that. One is putting funds into what they call a burial trust in a bank. It goes into a CD. We haven't used CDs for quite a while just because everybody knows what the interest rates have been over the last 10 years, and they're not real conducive to making that CD grow. Because if we set one of these up, it could be 5 years from now, it could be 10 years from now, and if you're getting like 0.04% or something, say 10 years from now, our prices will have gone up. Nothing ever goes down, it always goes up. And so all of a sudden the dollars that are here didn't keep up with the inflationary mark, so then at some point you got to make that up. So then the kids or whatever are going to have to come in with extra dollars. What we've used a lot, it's a burial insurance. And the insurance normally, it's a one-time payment, a one-time premium. So you sit down with the funeral home, you figure out, here's what I want. So say it's a traditional funeral and you picked out a casket, you picked out a vault, and everything comes to $12,000. You take and you put $12,000 into this burial insurance. It's normally like an annuity. Most of them are guaranteeing like 3% interest. What we've been seeing lately, over probably the last 10 to 15 years, inflationary costs in funeral service are running right around the 2.5% to 3% mark. So it stays really even. Now that I see that inflation is, they figured what last year one was like 7.5%, something like that. We'll see how that's going to affect things within the banks, and it's going to affect things with these burial insurances and as far as the products that we have to purchase. But those funds go in, they are what are called irrevocably assigned. When it's irrevocably assigned, so say you put this $12,000 in, it's irrevocably assigned, the funeral home is the beneficiary of those funds. The funeral home cannot touch the funds until the time of death. The one nice thing is if a person is in a situation where all of a sudden you have to go to a nursing home, the nursing home, the county, and you're asking for assistance, the county cannot consider that as part of your asset because it's sheltered. If it's irrevocably assigned, it's sheltered and it's not considered an asset anymore. And ultimately when you do that, I mean, you're looking at, gee, I want to do $12,000 for a traditional burial. That's a lot of money. Each individual person has to figure out on their own, do I want that money to go in there and be there for my funeral, or do I not? And where do I sit financially? And only each person can figure that out on their own, of what's best for you. So, yes?
If you get this set up and it's assigned to your particular place and you go out of business, then what happens?
Well, the question was, if it's assigned to us irrevocably and we go out of business, what happens? In the best of all worlds, we can't touch those funds unless we present a death certificate to the insurance company, or if it's set up in a CD, to the bank. And we're not going to be able to get a death certificate. So in the best of all worlds, that can't happen. There are people that say, when you say never and can't, it will at some point in time. If people are greedy out there and things can happen. I've got to say, in Minnesota, they've got probably the best consumer laws that are out there. I don't know of that having happened in Minnesota at all. It has happened out in the United States, definitely, where people have accessed those funds because the laws have not been strict enough. The other nice thing about Minnesota, even though it would be irrevocably assigned to us, if you move, those funds are 100% transferable to any funeral home as its interest may appear. And that's the way the contracts are written. Even though it's irrevocably assigned to the funeral home, it's 100% transferable. So if you move to Florida, it can go to Florida. If you move southern Minnesota, it can go to a funeral home in southern Minnesota.
Who gets to decide that?
What's it?
Who gets to decide where it goes?
The family.
Say I die and I haven't picked another funeral home out.
Then whoever is going to pick out the funeral home on your behalf, whether it be your spouse, children, brothers, sisters, then they'd be the ones, because you'd want to let them, whether it's the kids, spouse, wherever, you want to let them know that, okay, we have these funds and they're with ABC Funeral Home and the community where that's at. And if something happens and if we have services here, if you contact ABC Funeral Home, what they're going to do is they just need to get a copy of the death certificate from the funeral home providing, and they'll be able to get those funds released from the insurance company or the bank, made out directly to the funeral home that was the provider of the service, not the funeral home that it was initially set up with. If that makes sense to you.
Well, sounds a little.
I mean, that's kind of how it processes, yeah.
Sounds like it could be a big cluster.
It really isn't. From the standpoint of the funeral homes working together, to be able to get those funds transferred, that's not a problem. the cluster might occur within the family where it's down here, and the key is to make sure that family members know that there is these funds set aside here, but all of a sudden you're down in Florida and things are going to take place in Florida. Somewhere, somehow, that family needs to know that these funds are here so that those funds can get transferred down. And in Minnesota, if there's any excess funds then have to go back to the estate in Minnesota, under Minnesota law. And the reason they go back to the estate and not an individual is because if a person's on assistance in a nursing home, the county wants to be able to recover some of the dollars then that the taxpayers are paying to keep that person in the nursing home then. So that's one thing that would go back to the estate, and if there's any assets there, then the county tries to recover on behalf of us as the taxpayers. It's a two-edged sword. We're taxpayers, so we're helping other people. If we're the person in the nursing home, well, yeah, but I want to give my grandkids this and this and this. But if you're on assistance, there's not that ability to really start transferring funds to them, unless there's lots and lots of dollars. Then you can do that up to a certain point before you go on assistance. So, yes.
I have a question regarding, when my mom passed away, or before she did, she gave money to all us kids
Mm-hmm.
in some Minnesota
Yep.
funeral plan. Do you know?
Well,
It's a,
in a funeral plan, or
no, it's some organization in Minnesota where you put money, and it was through the funeral home, I think, that she was able to give.
did she set up funeral funds for each of the kids?
Right.
You can do that. That's part of a spend down. And so she was probably in a spend down mode where she had hers taken care of. Then she could technically give, it's called under the Gifting Act, and that change, and I don't even know what the current amount is, but that keeps changing all the time in Minnesota. It's usually getting less and less and less. But yes, there's a point where they can give so much to each of their children to help speed up the spend down to go on to assistance. And that is something that's still allowable by Minnesota law.
And is that done through the funeral home?
That can be done through the funeral home, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, and as long as we know it's her money, say it's her money, but she's doing it for you and your brother and your other sister or whatever, and it meets the law at the time, then it can be done. Yep. And I know that they're getting stricter and stricter with those spend downs of where that money can actually go before you get to that point. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Did you say that the only way to get this money that you have got at the funeral home for him,
Mm-hmm.
if you go out of business, the only way you can do it is through a death certificate?
Well, what'll happen is those funds then they'd still be intact, even though, say if we went out of business, which we're not planning on being out of business, but it can happen to anybody, I guess. But those funds are still intact. We can't get them, and you're still living. Those funds can be transferred to any funeral home at any point in time. So say ABC Funeral Home goes out of business, those funds in Minnesota are still intact, and you want to transfer them to XYZ Funeral Home over here, all you need to do is basically get a hold of, if they're out of business, there's going to be a conservator or whatever that's holding those funds or knows those pre-arrangements, and then that can be shifted over to the XYZ Funeral Home. Yeah, yeah. So it gets interesting, and it's concerning for families because there is a lot of money that you put aside for this, and I guess it has a lot to do with the reputation and how you feel your funeral home handles things to you, and I guess I know we really try to be right up front with families, and yes, we work hard and we really try to do what's right. So, and it looks like I'm getting close to. Okay. So there's two elements to this pre-planning a lot of times, and there's more to it, but you boil it down. There's the information that you're going to write down, and then the other part of it is the financial part of it. And then you put those two together, and usually what happens is, whether you have one, the other, or both, that information's all put in a file, and that file then is kept. For us, we keep it at the funeral home, and all of a sudden John Doe passes away, and normally, smaller community, most of the names will click with us, and say, yeah, I think we've got something. I'll go down, I'll check our file, and get the deed. Oh yeah, Doe, yep, John Doe, here it is. We'll pull it out, and we'll see if there's a written directive. We'll see what type of service that maybe they've planned, and we'll be in touch with family. And there's been a lot of times where we've called the family and said, yes, we give our sympathies to the family, and we talk about when they're going to come in. We'll mention, well, by the way, did you know your dad had a prearrangement? No, we didn't know that. Or sometimes it goes the other way. Well, Mom and Dad always talked about prearranging, so they have something with you. Well, they always talked about it. They never came in and did it. And then all of a sudden the kids are like, well, they said they were going to do it. What do we do? What do we do? Because they never talked about other than saying, we're going to do it. And that becomes the kicker sometimes. As far as they were going to do it, but they didn't do it, but the kids were led to believe that they did it. So, then at that point, and if we don't have a written directive or anything, at that point, it becomes up to the kids. Okay, what do you think Mom and Dad wanted? So, question?
Okay, say I pass and on my directive is that you're handling my funeral, but I'm gonna be buried in Wisconsin. Do I have to have another funeral home over there to take care of that end of it?
Normally not. The question was if we have the prearrangements and everything here, we have a service here, but the burial is going to be over in Wisconsin. What the laws say, crossing state lines, is that if we're doing the burial, if it's a full body burial with a casket, then we normally, I'll pick a town, Cumberland, Wisconsin. Just because I've got a brother over there who's a priest. So I know the area. But say we're going to be buried at the cemetery over in Cumberland, Wisconsin. We would contact the funeral home in Cumberland and say, so-and-so passed away. We had a service here. We're coming over for a gravesite service. Would one of your licensed people be willing to meet us at the cemetery just to stay in compliance with the law? And most times they'll say, yep, not a problem, or just swing by, drop off the burial permit with us, we'll get it to the right people, and go on out to the cemetery and take care of the burial. Most funeral homes work very well back and forth together that way, and we've done the same thing here, where if somebody's coming from out of state with somebody for burial up here, they'll call us and say, yep, one of us will run over and we'll just meet you at the cemetery, and not a problem. And, and just out of courtesy, a lot of times, we'll bring a check and just say, here's some dollars for helping us out. And a lot of times funeral homes coming in will do the same thing here, where whoever the person is, they might, you might get $25 or $50, take your wife out for a bite to eat. So I know we're getting close to that 12 o'clock time.
Oh, that clock is way.
Oh, am I way off on that one? Oh, I was looking at the wrong clock then. Okay, excellent.
We got like 13 minutes.
Excellent. So, while we've got some minutes here, maybe I'll throw out the question: is there any question that you ever wanted to ask a funeral director, but never had the chance to or the guts to, and this would be the time to do it? Yes.
So if you get cremated,
Mm-hmm.
is there laws where your ashes can go? And then can they go on our land or in the lake or?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So here's the yes part of it. If you have cemetery property, yes. If you want to keep them at home, you can. If you want to scatter them or bury them on your land, you can. If you do that, and this actually happened up in Aiken, where a family had done that. They'd buried ashes on the land. Then they sold the property, but they never disclosed that the ashes were buried on the property. There did turn out to be a lawsuit because they never disclosed that, because the people that bought wanted to back out, and they were using that as the way to back out. It didn't get anywhere in court. They threw it out. So the ashes are still buried there. And that's something where a person thinks, okay, I've got this property. We're never going to sell it. Property, at some point in time, that property will be sold. So then depending on if you're scattering ashes or if you're burying ashes, is that an issue to you?
So you have to disclose that? Or-
Well, you probably would, because then if all of a sudden, gee, we got ashes buried here. And I don't think it's so much scattering it. I think if they're buried and they're in an urn and you've got them buried, say, out in the flower garden, you're gonna wanna disclose that probably. A couple reasons is, well, gee, if they're buried there, you have to make the decision then, do I still wanna have access to that where I can come and spend time or not? And if you sell it, it's not your property anymore, but how do you reconcile that? Or do you dig them up and bring them somewhere else? And so I look at that where, you know, that's what cemeteries are for. And then you don't have that problem. We have lots of people that want to scatter them in waterways and in lakes, especially Mille Lacs Lake or their favorite fishing holes. Technically, you have to get permission from the DNR, pollution control, and I can guarantee you they're not going to give you permission to do that. If it happens, there is no health hazard with cremated remains that anybody's aware of. So it's not going to pollute the lake or anything, and there's not going to be a health issue. It's just the idea of people going out and scattering their ashes in the waterways or in the lakes or in that. So I tell families, if that's something that you're considering, I do not want to know about it because I don't want to be culpable. So that's where I leave it. We will just tell families, you know, you're supposed to have these permits before you can do that. Yes?
How about those Catholics?
The Catholics?
Yeah.
As far as Catholics,
I've always heard, first off, you know, they do cremation, but I know they do now.
yes.
But now my next thing is that they want that buried as soon as possible. They don't want that sitting on their land.
You're right. You're right. They start part of their part of what their basis in religion is that's still the body, and that should be not necessarily left at home. It shouldn't be scattered. It should be placed buried in a cemetery so that everybody knows where that body is. Does that happen with all the Catholics? No. But that's between the priest and the family. They talk about that, and especially up here in the wintertime, we don't bury cremated remains year-round. We do bury year-round for traditional burials, but it's a little bit harder actually to open up a smaller hole than it is a bigger hole. So they usually wait until springtime to bury there.
Jared, can I chime in?
Yes.
So at the first session in January, oh, there we go. Someone asked about local cemeteries and points of contact and such, and I've been gathering that, but I got responses all the way up until this morning. So a nice clean worksheet did not get done to hand out to you. I do have a sheet of paper in the back that says I'm interested in, and then it leaves for a name and address, like a mailing address or an email. So I do have all the points of contact for the townships in Aitkin County that have active cemeteries where you could look at purchasing a plot or whatever they have available. And then I'll also share, like, we knew that my mom was going to die up here, but that we wanted her buried in the cities. And so she ended up being cremated, and we did a niche in the cities. So we bought that niche years ago. So we all knew as her kids that that's where she was going to be placed. But we could really then have our service wherever we wanted to. And she was in hospice up here. They helped us facilitate with the Minnesota Cremation Society, getting her body there and those kinds of things. So there are ways to do a little bit of a staged approach too. If the $12,000 with a funeral home seems like one big decision that you're not quite comfortable with, you can break it up into pieces that, like, we knew she was going to be cremated and we knew that she was going to go to this niche, but there were a variety of things we didn't know about the service or the funeral home or whatever. So just things to think about. But I will have that handout that I can either email to you, send to you, or there can be copies here at the church too once I clean it up a little bit. But it has all the points of contact for Aitkin County.
And probably most of you don't realize Aitkin County, I mean, we're a fairly good-sized county, but we actually have close to a little over 40 cemeteries in Aiken County. So we've got them all listed at the funeral home and who the contacts and everything are too. We've got a book that I put together years ago, and we keep updating it, but
Oh, okay.
we've got the sexton's names and everything there. Yes?
Okay, how about being buried together?
As far as full burials or cremations?
Cremation.
Cremations, that can be done. A lot of cemeteries today will say that you can have 2 burials per grave. So that can mean 1 traditional burial, 1 cremation, or 2 cremations. Now with cremations, you're thinking, well, gee, you know, a lot of times those graves, the old standard is like 4 feet wide, 8 feet long. The newer ones are 5 by 10, because if you're using vaults, the vaults are a little bit bigger and things get really tight in the cemeteries. But even at 4 by 8, the old ones, well, gee, we can get more than 2 cremated remains on a lot. It's not the cremated remains that causes the issue. It's the markers for each person buried on that grave lot. So if you have 6 people on 1 grave lot, and you're going to try to have 6 markers, it becomes a maintenance nightmare for the cemetery officials. That's the reason why they usually limit it to 2. But in Minnesota, each cemetery has its own board technically, and each cemetery board sets its own rules and regulations governing how burials will take place in their cemeteries. So you might run across one that say, gee, you can have 3 cremated remains. Or there are some cemeteries in Minnesota, I know that it's 1 burial per grave lot, whether it's cremation or whether it's traditional. So each cemetery sets their own rules and regulations on how that's going to happen.
And just to add on to that, some cemeteries have columbariums, which are like a wall with niches in it for cremated rounds, and similar. Like we bought 4, each one holds 2. So like husband and wife, or my mom and my brother are together in there. But we shopped around, and it was different from
Yep.
cemetery to cemetery.
Pastor?
I don't know if this is relevant for anyone here, but maybe you want to just briefly touch on military honors and, you know, those that
Sure.
would like that.
Sure. Well, military honors are accorded to anybody who has a discharge other than dishonorable. So what happens is that a family, we will ask for a DD-214, their discharge papers. Excuse me. And at that point, we can contact the local VFW American Legion posts, and they have an honor group normally that will be there to provide that military honors. Military honors will include the rifle squad, normally playing of taps, folding the flag, and presenting the flag to the family. We, through the funeral home with that DD-214, we secure the flag. We make those contacts also for the honor guard. And the issuing point for the U.S. flag, which a lot of people don't realize, is the U.S. Post Office. They have a number of flags that are there. When we bring them the proper form, they give us the flag. Then it's in a little box about like that for the big flag. I mean, so it's all folded and everything. So there's been many a night I've been at my home with my iron and ironing board, getting all the wrinkles out and trying to make it look proper for the ceremony. If for some reason, say the service is here, but the person's being buried down in Fort Snelling, they have an honor guard there, and then we coordinate that with them. And Fort Snelling, they average about 25 burials a day between cremation and traditional. The honor guard will go and present. I think they start like at 9 o'clock in the morning and they go till like 3 in the afternoon. And they got little buses, they got a couple buses where they all have they're going different directions all the time, going out for the military honors for the veterans. Now it's not just veterans that are buried at Fort Snelling either. The spouses and dependent children can also be buried at Fort Snelling for a veteran. So.
What about Little Falls? I heard I couldn't go there.
Are you a veteran or?
My husband's a veteran.
Okay, if he's buried there, you can, but they charge. That's a state cemetery. It's not a national cemetery. So Fort Snelling's a national. Little Falls is a state cemetery. And they do charge, have some charges for the veteran and for a spouse that would be buried there. Whereas Fort Snelling National, there are no charges for the veteran or for the spouse or for dependent children or dependents. But yes, you could be as a spouse buried there if your husband's buried there. Yes. Yes. Other questions? Yes.
Such a thing as a
Green burials.
yes, what
There-
are the options on that?
There are green burials. In our area, there are no technically green cemeteries. But what a green burial is that when the person dies, their body is put into either like a cardboard casket, that the cardboard's going to go back to the earth as the body will go back to the earth, or like a wicker basket. There are cemeteries that are set up that way where they'll have things marked off, and then after so many years, then that grave would be reused again. But depending on, and I can't tell you, some people say, well, gee, how long will the body last? It has a lot to do with the soil conditions. Some soil conditions the body will decompose and break down faster than in other soil conditions. Sandier soil conditions take longer. If you have clay and a lot of water, it's going to go a lot quicker. So it's just dependent upon. But right in our area here, I know of no cemeteries that have been set up for green burials as of yet. And so whether that will happen here or not, you look at too, people talk about, well, gee, we're going to run out of cemetery space someday. And in the metropolitan areas, yeah, that's a possibility. Out in the country here where we're at, in God's country, as I like to call it, probably not such a big issue because we do have plenty of property most of our cemeteries, we're not even close to, in our area, filling them up. And they've been around most of them have been around for a long time. I don't know of any new, in the last close to 40 years, there's no new cemeteries in Aiken County that have been started. So, yes?
You alluded earlier to cremation, that there are different kinds of cremation.
What you can do with cremation, yeah. The question is, types of cremation services. So, a lot of times what will happen is a family will come in and say, well, yep, mom and dad want cremation. Okay. Do you want immediate cremation? Do you want immediate cremation with a service? Or do you just want immediate cremation with maybe a little graveside service and not a church service? Or in which we saw a lot of through COVID, especially when this first year and a half, COVID put a real damper, I think, on our community being able to pull together and support families that have lost loved ones because we couldn't gather. And so families would say, we want immediate cremation, we'll maybe do something at a later date. My best guess is about 50% of those families are doing something at a later date. The other 50% are saying, a year's gone by, a year and a half's gone by, we're just going to let it go. So there's that. We have these families too that come in and say, we want cremation, but we want to be able to have a viewing. We want the body present for the service, and then cremation. We do have available a rental casket, so we do our preparation work, the embalming. It's just like a full traditional service, except when the service is done, when we bring the casket out to the hearse, instead of going to the cemetery, we go back to the funeral home, and then we'll go to the crematory following that. And the crematory that we use, we do not have a crematory on site in Aiken. The crematory we use is based out of Brainerd. It's Helverson Taylor Funeral Home, and we're the only outside funeral home that they do cremations for. But we've got a very good working relationship with them, where we've got the code to actually get in their building. And short of actually starting up the retort, we leave all the proper paperwork we need and everything right there. And then what they do is they call us when the cremation's done. And by the way, it's in crematories, by law, they're only doing one cremation in that retort. Some of you probably a good share of you've heard the horror stories where different parts of the country, they might be doing 2 or 3, 4 people at once. And that's that's totally unethical and plain wrong. And I guess I look at it from the standpoint of, I would not use that funeral home I guess the way I would put it is, if somebody in my family was going to be cremated, would I use that funeral home, that retort? And Helverson Taylor, the answer to me is yes, I would use them, because their morals and values and professionalism ranks right up there with where I feel that we need to have them. So, but those are different categories as far as cremation. I mean, cremation is cremation. It's the basically reduction of the body by fire. It's just another way of disposition versus burial. So, and of course, once cremation takes place, I mentioned earlier, there is no health hazard with cremated remains. So if you decide, gee, I want to keep them at home, or if I want to have a little bit of cremains in a necklace, or if I want to take and scatter them, there's no health hazard there. So. Yes?
Could you just give a general basic average cost for cremation versus casket?
Yep. Average cost we're seeing right now, I would say immediate cremation to maybe a cremation with a service without the rental casket, you're probably in that $4,000 to $6,000 range. If you're looking at traditional burial, you're probably somewhere in that $9,000 to $14,000 range, depending upon the type of casket and vault. You pick out kind of same thing with the range for cremation, is if you pick out an urn, or if you're building your own urn, what things do you want us to take care of? Sometimes families will say, well, yeah, we want you to take care of paying gratuities for the musicians and pastor and the ladies with the lunch and that. So that's called what we call cash advance items, but it still adds to the funeral bill. And whether you do it out of your own pocket and take care of those things, or we do it, it's still all kind of in one ball, because when you get to the end, that's still all part of that whole funeral thing. Yep.
Jerry, that cost that you just quoted, is that with the funeral home services included?
Yeah.
So
And-
like when we went through the Minnesota Cremation Society, it was closer to 2,000 or so.
Yep. And there's
for just the cremation.
And there are places out there that are cheaper than we are. There's some that are more expensive. I guess I've always looked at it, and I know the fellows that have taken over from me look at it from the standpoint too. We have to look at what our costs are, and then it's based on, we don't want to run in the red, because then we wouldn't be around. So we still need to make a profit to be able to stay in business to do that. There are other funeral home or other
Well, I just said
businesses.
we didn't have a funeral home, so we weren't getting
Yep.
those additional services.
Right, you didn't get those additional
So it
services.
wasn't apples to apples, yeah.
Right, and that's what a lot of times we have to tell families, is that, yes, you can go to this one or this one or this one, and it's going to be cheaper. You're not going to get this and this and this and this and this. So it depends on what a family really is looking for and what they really want. Some families want just the basics and the least expensive, and that's okay. Some families want that more family-oriented, and they want to be able to have all these other things that are included, that we include. So, that's where I tell families too. It's really important that you figure out what you want, and, it doesn't hurt to shop around a little bit and ask them, what will you do for us with this? Because this is what we want. What can you do? Can you put a price with it? And in the area here, yes, you've got your communities in that, but, it's not that difficult to, talk to people in Brainerd or Crosby or Aiken or Isle or, it doesn't hurt to do a little bit of research.
Jerry, are you able to stay a little bit if people had some
Sure,
more
yep.
one-on-one questions?
Yep.
Okay, well, just out of respect for people's time that are here and just the time frame that we give, I'm going to close us out, but I do want to let you know, so I have a variety of conversation starters to, if you're thinking about having conversations with your loved ones and it's sort of a little bit intimidating. Again, I would be happy to print some of those out and leave them here at the church or email them to people if they are interested. A variety of you may know that in a prior life I was in law enforcement, and several of the things that I had to do in that capacity were make death notifications. which were one of the worst kind of calls to have to go on to, but also respond to family conflicts where sometimes they were fighting about the exact things, like the example that Jerry gave. And for me, as a young police officer at that time, it became very important to me to try to do whatever I could within my own family and loved ones to prevent that from happening, which is for me sort of what my motivation was around even us having a discussion around this series. So if you're just curious how to handle a situation, I'm not interested in getting in anyone's business, but I have lots of ideas and classes that I've gone to around these topics to just have suggestions of ways that you can phrase things or look at things or set things up to try to, there's nothing better than having the conversations when you're not in that emotional place, because it's an awkward conversation, but it's awkward no matter, right? I mean, when the person's died, then you're in grief and you have the emotions. And so if you can have those conversations before you've reached that point and get everyone on the same page, it's really helpful. So let's take a moment and thank Jerry.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And don't forget to pick up flyers if you're interested in either our next session on care concerns. The last session in April will be on healthcare directives, or that mental health first aid. And then I know a few people were interested in folders for people that couldn't make it today or might be online. And so feel free, there are a couple extra out there if you wanted to grab them.
And one, as Mary was talking about, one of the things in your folders is a little booklet. It's called The Talk of a Lifetime. And that deals specifically with talking with family about these issues. So thank you again for having me. And if anybody has the ability to shorten up winter, I'm all for that. Thank you.
One more thing for the people that are still in the room, there is some soup out in the narthex area, so if you want to join for lunch, feel free. There's coffee there too.
You can't be too big or too small, and then at the time of death,
odd for me to think that it had to have